you ever had a nightmare and been grateful when you wake up? Imagine having to experience the same nightmare over and over, even when you're awake. Post-traumatic stress disorder affects people in different ways. For many, it includes intrusive memories, avoiding places that remind them of the trauma, negative thoughts and mood, and changes in emotional reactions to things in their lives. Fortunately, there's treatment available for people who have been through traumatic experiences. We'll talk about some of them later in the program. On today's show, we'll meet a kidnapping victim, a pastor for an executed Bali 9 man, and an expert in PTSD. Hi, I'm Sally Ann, and I'm a clinical psychologist, wife, and mother of 4. Being a TV host allows me to share the difficult times experienced by others, and then we follow up with their positive journey to let you see the opportunities that you can create in your own future. Warren Rodwell is a former soldier, university English teacher, prolific world traveller, hostage survivor, and currently is the longest held Australian captive out of war. His published biography tells of prolonged hunger, beheading threats, and a $2 million US ransom demand. So thanks for joining us on the show today, Warren. I really appreciate you coming. Now, you were living in a small village, and this is where it all started. Tell us a bit about that.
Oh, that's right. I was in a village in the island of Mindanao in the southern Philippines, and I built a house. I got married. Someone local, built a house, and it was in a subdivision just outside the town. But on the December 5, on 2011, around sunset, then 4 men burst in with rifles, automatic rifles, dressed as policemen. Then they shot me through the hand, and as a consequence, I ended up having to have one finger cut off. So
at the time, is that, or did they?
At the time, at the actual capture time.
Wow. And so then you were taken somewhere and you were held for well, we won't go into how long yet, but you were held for a long time. What happened from when you left the village?
Sure. Well, once I was, as soon as I was shot, then I was handcuffed and basically dragged across rice fields, maybe a couple of kilometres to a river, a boat, then taken out to sea.
Wow. And so there were, how many people were there? What was it like? What was it? Because you were 15 months is how long you were gone for.
Well, it is. It's much more complex than the time we have at the moment allowed. But I ended up being on 28 different camps, but all in islands in the autonomous region, the Islamic autonomous region. So these were extremists. So then also up in a war zone in mountains for about 10 weeks.
Wow. Because what we've just seen earlier is the footage of you, the proof of life video. I can't imagine what that, tell us what was going through your head at that time. What was that like?
Well, by the time that one had taken, that piece was filmed, I had been, I'd sort of already gone through shock and so on. But most of the time it was really just a lot of emptiness. And the main difficulty was maintaining my own sanity because of being in isolation. But from what I heard you mention earlier in the introduction and saying how people are affected, and that, I probably had an advantage in a way because I was in isolation. So there was no one else to sort of mirror any emotions off. And possibly afterwards too.
So tell us about that. So you were, when you were moved these 28 times, you were just left, they just kind of abandoned you, they just put you somewhere?
Oh no, well in hiding, but the people, it was usually local people that had been recruited because it's a cottage industry, kidnapping. The frightening part really, and especially from a woman's point of view, you would see this, that kidnapping is only scratching the surface of human trafficking. That's where I was fortunate being male as well, because there was, and my age, maturity.
So are you saying, like, from a sexual point of view, they weren't interested in you? Is that what you mean?
Oh,
that,
yeah, most of
what
them were
you
fairly
meant?
young guys, and they were, you know, some false bravado and a bit gung-ho. But when they try to start up some of the conversation, I just tell them I'm not really interested.
Yeah.
You know.
So what about the training? Because you were a soldier. Did that training help as well? I mean, you said a lot of the time was in isolation, but I'm wondering if the training was of any help or a hindrance? Or?
It's a start, because when you have to live in jungles, it's the same as a war zone. So you really the elements, you know, climate, lack of water, that sort of thing, and the survival things are what you are basically taught in any military training. But my greater experiences in the world, such as living in China for 10 years and being familiar with totally different cultures, that's probably what helped me even more. You know, because you just realise that here is a very interesting point. The sake of truth, you know, lies and those things that aren't lies, I've found that's generally more of a Christian concept. When you're in countries that don't have Christianity, you know, they don't have this sort of wrathful God with a bolt of lightning ready to strike you down if you tell a lie.
So it's not an issue for them.
So you just accept that what anybody tells you has no meaning.
Yeah, because you know, from that clip, from the Proof of Life video, I could see that you just had given up on anyone assisting you either. I mean, I can imagine it was it 12 months, I think, by that stage, and you'd been, you know, waiting for the Australian government to help. You were obviously in isolation a lot as well, and there were threats of beheading as well. Is that right or not?
Yeah, that was quite regular. There were possibly about 10 Proof of Life videos made. They were about every two months. So yeah, not only about 3 got released, I believe. There was a few charlatans, you know, in between. But when somebody had come, I would have no notice of anyone coming. And the guy I was speaking to in that Proof of Life, at the end I say, is that it? I just had total contempt for him, because I'd seen him at different times. And we had a nickname for him, everybody did. Abu is what they called everybody, like brother, but his nickname was Abu Liar. And even one of the young guards had given him that when we were in the mountains, because he lied so much he didn't even know the truth himself. Always full of empty talk.
So was there any point, and you know, maybe not, but was there any point where you just thought, and you said in the video, you know, the Australian government, no one seems to be helping me. Did you ever give up? Or was there ever a point where you just thought?
I'm glad you asked that, because this is a point I would like to emphasise. At that time, I'd said, the thought had gone through my mind, probably that day or a day before, where these guys had turned up. Now, I hadn't really seen anyone, you know, or communicated with them. The guy that was mainly in charge, the guard, he had the mentality of a mountain goat, if that, you know, and he was totally empty. No, there's nothing, any initiative. Him and another fellow used to climb trees and shout and make sounds like animals, and I'd shout back at them to tell them to keep quiet, because after 5 hours it does your head in. But the point of giving up hope, actually, once I had given up hope, it was a sense of freedom. Because I created an acronym for myself. We've heard of the one for fear, you know, false evidence appearing real. The one I made for hope was, here's one possible eventuality. And we all get a bit things mixed up, faith and hope, right? But hope is a thing we tend to you know, cling on to. Then we get disappointed.
Absolutely.
Once you go beyond hope, you're free.
So you had that sense of, well, freedom in a, you know, in a figurative sense, I guess. But speaking of freedom, what happened when and how did you find out that you were going to be released? I've heard the story a little bit about it, but tell us what actually went through your head at that point in time, or how much
I had a gut
warning did you
feeling
have?
something was happening near the end. But you know, I didn't build up any hopes, naturally enough. So
because you'd been let down so many times, I guess. And so when you, because I understand that you were put into a boat and told to just row, and you were found by some locals, is that right?
Well, I was transferred to a smaller fishing boat, taken into shore. Then I had to climb up an embankment, and I had atrophy and deadened nerve endings in my feet. And when released, I could barely walk. It was up to about here. The ankle. So.
And so, what was it like then? Once you had, you know, you realised that you were safe, that you kind of went back to, I guess, government officials. I don't really know who took you, and then then finally coming back to Australia. What was all that like?
All right, coming back to Australia, because I had lived abroad for some time, I was fortunate that I had been back within the last 10 years, the previous 10 years for about a year. So I'd had gone through some re-entry shock, but coming back was rather surreal, really, because it was, I'd been totally institutionalised. I hadn't moved much than a few metres. I never had to make any decisions for myself. And of course, when you come back into society, you just see how surreal, or really how strange it is.
And how's it gone since then? I'm just noticing the time. How has it gone since then? How have you coped with things?
Good. I've spent a lot of time on my own. I've developed my own. I was involved. I collaborated with the writing of my biography. But I decided to develop my creativity, so there's also a song that I wrote that's been released.
Yes,
by,
Situation Not Normal.
That's it, yeah, that's what I wanted the biography to be named that. But the guy that did it, the Mad Cowboy Disease from Sydney, with the deep voice of Josie Gritter. There's techno cowpunk. That's good. It's worked out well.
Because I saw a clip of that on the internet as well. I think that you are such an amazing man. You have such, you've come through this by everything I can see with such courage and strength. And as you said, that for you, that giving up of being freed has actually freed you to some degree, and you've come back and here you are, and I'm so honoured to have met you, and thank you so much for being part of this show. It's been really great, genuinely, to have met you, so thank you very much,
That's
Warren.
the best wrap-up I've ever had.
Oh, there you go. All right, so after the break, we're going to talk to the woman who walked with the 2 Bali men who were executed recently.
And it was through meeting them and being so inspired by their transformation that I said those fatal words, if there's anything I can do to help, let me know.
Growing up as she did in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, Christie Buckingham has always had a heart for justice. This has led her into many interesting scenarios, meeting up with various people across the world, including Mayuran Sukumaran and Andrew Chan, 2 of the Bali 9 that were recently executed. Christie was Mayu's chosen spiritual director and also a close friend of Andrew Chan. So thanks for being here, Christie.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Sally Ann.
So through your work, you became involved with the Bali, or at least 2 of the Bali men. Tell us a little bit about how you came into that role.
Well, I didn't need another job to do. We do quite a bit of work overseas and even here in Australia. But I met the 2 boys once when I went to Corrobocan with a girl that I went to college with. And it was through meeting them and being so inspired by their transformation that I said those fatal words, if there's anything I can do to help, let me know.
Okay, and then they actually did take you up on that, obviously.
2 weeks later I had a letter from Andrew saying, I think you can help with this, I think you can help with that, I think you can help. Some of basically the things that they were doing, the programs that they were doing inside Corrobocan.
So you've been involved right from the start then with these young men?
No, not yes, from the start I was, because in my my journal that I write every day, I said, how dumb can you get and still breathe? Nevertheless, Lord, show your mercy. But I didn't think that I'd be part of that mercy, not as hands-on as it turned out. So you have to be very careful what you say and what you pray.
You certainly do, don't you?
Yeah.
And so you were there right through, well, the last part of the last few years, by the sounds of things, supporting them. And tell us what that was like.
Well, every time you'd see them was a bonus, and every time you left, you thought, is this going to be the last time? And it's quite an interesting thing, because when somebody is healthy and well, in my work, obviously, I've been with many people, roadsides, bedsides, different sorts of places, growing up in the Troubles, where people have been dying. But it's quite obvious they're dying, unlike 2 healthy young men who are improving and awakening and becoming wiser and becoming leaders. And so the weight of that you carry with you every single day of your life.
So what was that like then? Because you're saying that they're, and I imagine they were probably learning a lot and spending a lot of time reflecting and having people like you around to talk to. So how was it? Because were you actually there when they were told that they were going to be put to their death?
As it turned out, Sally Ann, yes, I was. My husband was there when Mayu was given his letter, and I was there when actually physically in the jail when Andrew was told.
Wow.
And I remember distinctly the first letter that came, and then we got a reprieve, and that was, phew, that was amazing. And then the next day I walked in, I had some paperwork I needed to do for the boys, and I came in a bit later, and Andrew said, "Have you heard the news?" And I said, "What news? Is this some media thing? What news?" And he pulled me over to the side and he said, "They've said it's going to be February."
Wow.
And, you know, clearly it wasn't February, but that's what you were living with every day, not knowing exactly when you were going to get those 72 hours notice.
Wow. And look, we know how difficult it was for them, certainly, and that's, you know, that's another story, I guess. But my reason for bringing you in was because you actually lived it too. It wasn't happening to you, but happening around you. How did you feel about that? So when the letter came through, you must have just felt, I imagine, quite helpless and devastated. How did you feel?
Well, the whole way along, I said to the boys, you must prepare for the worst, but believe for the best.
Yeah.
And so I kept that hope alive right up until the last 3 minutes, basically. Because as it turned out, one of the people actually did get a reprieve in those last 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So, you know, until I heard those shots ring out, I was still hoping that someone would see sense and see the futility of having two people who were probably our greatest weapons against the war against drugs being executed. So, you know, I just had to live very much in the moment, had to be very grateful for the time that I had spent with them and did spend with them. And I learned so much.
What do you mean so much? About yourself, do you mean, or about the world?
About everything. Like, even the second last day, which was the day that Andrew got married, and we knew he was getting married that day, we were moved around from pillar to post by different organizations. When we got onto the island, they spent less than 30 seconds talking about what had been. Because when you know your time is coming to an end, you don't waste time on the aggravations or the irritations. And something, I just stopped in my stead and thought, wow, if I could spring back from a disappointment or an aggravation half as quickly as that, you know, I'd be a much better person. And so I continually learned from them right up until the end. And their courage, even in the end, and making sure that other people around them were feeling comfortable was such an outstanding proof to me of their rehabilitation and their life that was lived for other people.
So what was all of that like for you? Because you just said until you heard the bullets fire. So you were there right at the last moment. How did you cope through that? Because I imagine, as you said, there's been a reprieve for one of the young men, and you were there when, you know, the most devastating moment of their lives. How did you manage that? How did you cope with that, and how's it been since then?
Well, as you know, my role is very much as being yes, of course, I'm a human rights advocate, but I'm also a spiritual director. So it's important for me to keep my own groundedness, my own centeredness. So I had prayed this through, I had been spending time in reflection, and I'd had a still small voice the day before saying, "You will be there right up to the end," which I thought was quite interesting, because I actually had thought that if we were allowed up even till 8 o'clock, that would be, you know, an extreme. And the next morning we were told we weren't allowed at all on the island. But that voice was still saying to me, "You will be there, be prepared." So I knew I had to block out everything else that would distract me and keep focused on the boys and their well-being.
Look, thanks so much, Christie, for being part of the show. I really appreciate it. After the break, we're going to talk to a PTSD expert to share with us the signs of PTSD and how it can be treated. Stay tuned. Dr. Lynette Evans is a clinical psychologist and academic in the Department of Psychology and Counselling at La Trobe University. Dr. Evans teaches and coordinates the professional training programs for postgraduates at La Trobe and has a special interest in PTSD. Her clinical and research work has involved the impact of PTSD on families, particularly in war veterans and their families. So we've heard stories today from Warren and from Christie. I'm just wondering, does PTSD occur in lots of situations like these that they've experienced?
Yes, so PTSD is defined by someone experiencing a trauma that threatens their life, or experiencing loved ones who may have been threatened. So there may be some close association with someone who's been threatened.
Yeah. Now, I know that there's different types, because obviously I'm a clinical psychologist too, so I know that there's a bit of a...
need to teach you.
No, but there's a difference. There's two different types of conditions. What are they, and what's the difference between them? So there's acute...
Yes, that's right. So the acute stress disorder is something that someone might experience immediately after the trauma, so fairly close to the traumatic experience. And then post-traumatic stress is something that is experienced within about 3 months after the trauma, or it can actually reoccur for people many, many years later. So sometimes they may not have symptoms immediately after the trauma, but then they'll start experiencing post-traumatic stress 10, 20 years later in some cases.
Which we do know that with war veterans
That's
in
right,
particular.
yes.
Look, there's a really wide range of different things that happen to people afterwards. How do we know when it's, how do they know? So how do people know when it's actually a problem? So we'd expect immediately some sleepless nights immediately after an event, but how do we know when it's becoming a problem?
The easiest test really is to look at whether their functioning is changing. So you're right, there's a whole series of symptoms that we might go through as psychologists to check off whether we're convinced someone has PTSD or another mental health problem. But for the person themselves, what we'd be interested in them identifying is their change in functioning. And sometimes that's quite difficult for the person themselves, so their family can be really helpful in noticing changes. So there'll be marked changes perhaps in their mood or the way they're behaving. They've withdrawn socially, they don't like to interact with friends or family anymore. They may start drinking or alcohol or taking drugs to try and sort of manage their symptoms. So it's really their level of functioning that they'd look at.
So if someone realised that they had some of these symptoms and were starting to struggle a little bit or having some changes in relationships, that sort of thing, where is there treatment? And if so, how do they go about getting treatment?
Yes, there is treatment, and there are some very good treatments. Sometimes we know from the past, and particularly in the area I was working with war veterans, that they delayed seeking treatment, partly because of fear of how people would judge them, but also because of fear that they may not actually be able to be helped.
Okay.
So yes, we do know that they can get effective treatment.
So where do they go? Where would a person, so if there's someone now that's been through some type of trauma, whether it's through war or some other life-threatening event, how would they go about getting treatment? Would you recommend going to see a doctor, or what would be the first port of call?
They certainly can go and see their GP, although it does vary a little bit on the education of the GP around these issues. I'd recommend they look at the Australian Psychological Society website, and they can find a psychologist who treats trauma. It's fairly easy, I think you would agree, to find your way through that website.
Yes, there's a nice little find a psychologist link there.
That's right, so I think that's probably the best way to go. To be referred under the Medicare system, they then will need to go to a GP and get the referral so that they can get the treatment through Medicare.
Yes, and one of the things that I would say in private practice is that we do not have enough sessions. We have 10 sessions a year, and we need to do something about that. But
that's true.
Yeah, look. Yeah,
the other place that I'd really recommend people look at is the Australian Centre for Post-Traumatic Mental Health. And they have a whole list of psychologists who also treat trauma, any type of trauma. So that can be from car accidents to war trauma to
whatever.
yes.
Look, thank you very much, Lynn, for being part of the show. I've really appreciated you sharing with us how to get treatment and where. And a huge thanks to all of our guests today. Warren flew down from Queensland to be part of our show, and Christie dropped by in between trips back to Bali and other places. The message from today is that if you're worried about yourself or a loved one, and you've been through a traumatic situation that you aren't dealing very well with, speak to your doctor or a mental health professional, or go to one of the websites that Lynn mentioned earlier. Thanks again for watching the Sally Ann Show. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, and we want your feedback, so contact us on our Facebook page or follow me on Twitter.